of the House of Bourbon, which was Marie Antoinette's house, the King Louis's house. And so, but what they thought at first was they had entered onto Versailles when they were having some kind of pageant or viva tableau or something like that, and where everyone was dressed up in period. And later researching it and talking to the people in charge of the place, absolutely nothing like that had been going on, and certainly not near the Petit Trianon, which was the small palace that was reserved just for Marie Antoinette. And they said, no, nothing like that. They were very closely watched, guarded, and such things required all sorts of permission and bureaucracy, and absolutely nothing like that had been going on. They also had followed a path which no longer existed. They did go back again and try to retrace their steps, and they could not do it. The path no longer existed.
That is very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this was a book. This, again, you can get in Britain. Middle class was a hard thing to achieve at that particular time. It was the very end of the Victorian period, and once you achieved it, you didn't throw it away lightly, and you didn't destroy your reputations when you were at Oxford, and you're a woman, and you were the first women's college there, and you weren't allowed to even get a degree. You could go there and you could study, but you weren't granted a degree. They were fighting tooth and nail for equality, so they certainly weren't going to jeopardize this over anything trivial. And the women were even in competition with each other. One was the principal, the other one was the vice principal, and wanted to become the principal, and the other one didn't really want to let go. So the two women were rather at odds with each other. And so what they agreed on, and when they finally wrote this book, was based on what they had both written down separately after their experiences, and they went with that. And to the day they died, they insisted that what happened to them actually happened to them. They did not later change their minds or say it was a hoax or anything of the sort.
Interesting. That is interesting. You know, I've often wondered sometimes if residual hauntings are actually time slips or vice versa. You know, when you see these things and these events, it kind of makes you think. I'll tell you one thing. If I seen stuff like what you just mentioned and went back and then the past's not there, I wouldn't know how to take that. That would definitely think you'd had a time slip or something like that. What do you think?
Well, I think you're either in a parallel universe or you actually were seeing reflections of the past. Now, some of this sounded like it might be repeater. They said that the woman with the milk jug and the servant in the doorway of the cottage definitely seemed like a viva tableau, which literally means a living tableau where people's image a painting, but they're living people, and they just stand very still, and they did not move. And they both saw that. But they did interact with the two men in livery and asked for directions to the Petit Trianon. And so that wasn't just a repeater experience. That was an actual thing. But then they also said that the wind seemed to have stopped, the sun seemed dim, and everything was flat and sort of gray and two-dimensional at times. So they had the distinct impression they weren't completely in the past, but just sort of were bridging it slightly. And it was their conclusion that they somehow slipped through time to a certain degree, and that some of them, or one of them, saw things sometimes that the other one didn't. So they're each viewing the past slightly differently and sometimes the same.
They were lucky they were able to come back.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have to be honest with you. If you had that experience, wouldn't you be a little frightened that you might have slipped into a past time and can't get back? I mean, I would. But being very rational, they just assumed that what they were seeing was some kind of pageant or dress-up or costume thing going on at Versailles, you know, that was reflecting that period. But they later found out that that absolutely wasn't the case. So, again, did they go back in time, or were they just viewing incidents from the past? Was there a crossover phase, a weak spot in time? Could be. We've had lots of reports of lots of people around the world doing exactly this all the time. It's in the tens of thousands, actually, of people saying that this has happened to them. From people having a barbecue in their backyard in England and having a thunderstorm strike and a man disappear for 3 days and then reappear at the exact spot with no recollection of where he'd been, wearing the same clothes, soaking wet, missing one shoe because he's half in the pond and half out, to people in Peru who investigated an old stone cottage up in the mountains and saw what looked like people dressed in 17th century costume having a party, complete with torches lit and the whole bit. The woman tried to step inside, was pulled back by her friend. The half of her that went in became totally paralyzed. She suffered from a rare type of paralysis, which the doctors can't explain. She was treated, and there was nothing they can do about it. And as far as I know, she's still paralyzed. The half of her that went into that house was the half of her that was affected permanently. Semi-paralysis, half the body, or hemi-paralysis is two different words for it, where literally half of her was paralyzed and the other half wasn't. And they went back, and there was no sign that there was ever a party there or anything of the sort.
You know, it makes me wonder how many people maybe have that happen to them and they actually aren't able to come back. People have gone missing. You know how many people go missing in this country, let alone worldwide? Maybe they go through a portal, or maybe they go back and...
FBI, 60,000 people a year here disappear permanently, not counting for murders, kidnappings, parents stealing the child from another parent, all that. You take all that out of it, and you still have, because there's close to 1 million who disappear every year in America. But if you get rid of all of that, that still leaves 60,000 according to the FBI. My figure is a little more conservative. I think it's more like 50,000. But it's every country in the world this is happening in. Where are these people going? What's happening to them? David Paulides, when his books about missing 411, people disappearing out of our national parks at a phenomenal rate, same thing. What's happening to these people? Where are they going? People talk about being abducted all the time. Over 1 million people now are claiming abduction by aliens or UFOs. And that's great in a way because they get to come back. But all the rest of these people just disappear completely. Are they disappearing in time? Are they disappearing in space? What's going on? This is something we should ask. I mean, we're talking about 60,000 people a year. That's a
crazy.
lot of people. That's a good-sized town full of people disappearing from America every year. Actually, again, it's almost 1 million people every year, but don't count the murders, don't count the kidnappings, don't count the parents stealing the child from the other parent, or people just wanting to disappear and start a new life, get rid of all of that. You still have that 60,000 every year, close to 30,000 in Australia. And God knows how many people from every other country around the world. A lot of them don't keep such records. Where are people going?
Well, you know what? I've had so many people on the show the last couple months, that claim they were abducted. Timothy Collin, Calvin Parker, a whole bunch of people, Dave Edmonds, all these people claim that they were abducted. They all tell me the same thing, that they thought whatever abducted them was evil. But, Timothy Collin, he was like the number 9th implant removal from the late Dr. Roger Lear. The last time he was on my show, we had a hard time. He was on a landline. I tell you, they were static. He went to a cell phone. They were static. It was crazy. It's like somebody was trying to jam him from talking because every time we went on to a certain subject, everything would just scramble. But after the show, he told me, he texted me and said, you know what? I have been abducted a second time. So I got to get him back on the show because he's been really quiet about that. He's been on my show 4 or 5 times in the last 2 years. And I've asked him repeatedly, have you ever been abducted again? Because the last time he had his implant removed, then a couple months later, him and his wife were going to town. He saw a UFO off the side of a mountain come swooping down right in front of his vehicle. And, it just made me wonder, maybe he was reimplanted again. Because, he's saying that he's now starting to remember of another abduction.
Well, that's not uncommon. And as a MUFON field investigator and also as a researcher for the last almost 30 years, I've come across this again and again. There was a astronomer in upstate New York, and he claimed abduction. And I had a horrible time getting him to tell me anything when I would visit him. He just couldn't talk about it. And finally, he sent me a tape where he'd set up a camera in his living room and recorded himself talking about it. And for the first 10 minutes on that video, I had to watch him smoke cigarette after cigarette and constantly take sips from his drink. This man was absolutely neurotic about having to even talk about it at all. But he did talk about it, and apparently he had been abducted repeatedly, and it finally stopped in his late 20s. And he described in detail some of the abductions, that was the blue short dwarf-like hooded figures that took him, that they smelled like rotting wet cardboard, that they made strange sort of chittering noises, and the Greys seemed to be in charge, and he had been abducted repeatedly. Now, this is a man who had a security clearance, was working on software for the Black Hawk helicopter at the Singer plant in Binghamton, New York, and was also an astronomer. This man was no idiot. This man was no nut, and he was no fool. I'd known him for years. I believed him. And I said to him at one point, I said, you know, you sound almost wistful about not being abducted anymore. I said, do you kind of miss it? He says, yes, Rob, I do. I said, in other words, it kind of made you feel special, even though it was kind of traumatic? And he said, absolutely. And I said, then they lost interest in you. And he goes, yes, that's exactly how I feel. I was sort of special because they were singling me out for repeated abductions, and then it came to an end. And whatever interest they had in me apparently ceased. And I said, are you sure about that? And he said, yes, I'm fairly sure, because I haven't had any experiences since. So there you go. There's someone who actually felt like a jilted bride.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people like that, but I'm wondering, why do they have to keep abducting people? And this has been going on for years and years and years. The same with like cattle mutilations have been going on for years. We're talking about all through the 1800s.
Heard about the recent ones up in Oregon.
Oh, yeah. But you know what? I found out about the one in Oregon, too. You know, they figured now that the bull was still alive when it was abducted and the eyes were removed because, you know, they said if it was on its side and the eyes, you know, removed, the liquid behind the eyes and the brain would have ran down off the side of the, you know, the mouth of the animal. But no,
right.
It ran off the nose.
Well, not only that, but they have these cauterizations. They just found quite a number of cattle recently that have been mutilated like this. No sign of blood drained from the bodies, eyes removed, rectum excised, sometimes the male or female genitals also removed. And of course, and I think we discussed this before, there was that case of the man in São Paulo, Brazil, back in the late 80s, and it didn't come out until the early 90s. The coroner's report and the photographs of the coroner's report came out with it, and this man had undergone the same traumatic, identical things happened to him. Puncture wounds under his armpits and in his stomach, internal organs sucked out through these tiny holes, his eyes removed, part of his jawbone removed, his rectum excised, his genitals, his testicles excised, and everything looked cauterized, and there was no blood on the ground around him. It was as if he had been dropped there. And then when they did an autopsy on the brain, they determined that he died from massive trauma, from pain, and he was tortured alive. They said there was no sign of any kind of anesthetic in his body. There was no type of, so they had to assume that this had all been done to him while he was alive and conscious.
That's what's scary. The same thing with the cattle. They figure that the cattle are alive while this is going on till they die from it. But could you imagine the extreme hell a person or what animal would have to go through? You know, like Timothy Collin, you know, he doesn't remember exactly what happened to him, but Calvin Parker, you know, saying that when he was taken aboard the spaceship and the creature, you know, tried to put her hand down his throat and come out his nose. You know, the pain he was going through, they didn't do anything to try to leave the pain. Anyway, we're going to go on break. Rob, we'll be back for the last half an hour, and I want to talk more about this and then maybe how these UFOs and these aliens use something like the black hole or something for time travel. We'll be back in 4 minutes. You're listening to Night Dreams Talk Radio After Dark.
Selfish and cruel since his youthful days in school. His siblings he never did treat well. His self-centered bent was his dark side lament, with a focus on hypnotizing spells. He memorized laws to help sharpen his claws for a future for which he was bent. The time would surely